Good morning, everybody. Great to be here. Beautiful drive, an interesting drive. I think if you come up 81A these days, isn't it? It's a lot different than it looked certainly, obviously 50 years ago, but just looks a lot different than 10 years ago, which is a lot of the reason we're here. I thought I would do just a quick little icebreaker, if I may. If you'll bear with me, please. It's been unseasonably warm the last few weeks, has it not? Okay, we're in record territory, all right? Today should be the 12th day of 80 degrees or higher in February. What's the most ever in February? Guess.
12.
12! We're going to tie our record today. That's good for a month. And we're also going to get close to the all-time record February high this weekend. What's that temperature?
88.
Wow, 88 is right there. That's a 2018 Go 16 calendar. It's got some beautiful pictures in there. That's the new satellite. So anyway, enough of that. But we are in the point of this is we are in and it was just mentioned by the previous speaker, we're in a period of constant change, right? Constant change. It's interesting, it's fascinating, it's much bigger than us, but it's affecting all of us, and that's what we're all here about today. So without further ado, let me introduce today's panelists. We'll focus on four main themes related to the overall state of the reserve theme, the art of science in our community. The art of science is intended to explore the ways in which we make decisions as individuals and communities, while the science and research to inform those decisions is continually investigated. I'll start today's panel session off with a few questions that focus on the following themes of communication to public, making decisions without firm science, community preparedness and response, and storm economic impacts. Following the moderator-guided panel session, I'll invite any questions from you, as we've already mentioned this morning. At that time, please approach the center to introduce yourself and ask a question of the panel. Actually, we'll be over on that side. Are we going to move it, or are we going to stay over?
We'll keep it right here.
Okay, very good. So before jumping into the questions, let's get to know our panelists. Dr. Don Resio is the director of the Taylor Engineering Research Institute at the University of North Florida. He's been a leader in the meteorological and oceanographic research for over 40 years, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing him for a story relatively recently, and some great new information coming out this summer based on our recent hurricane activity that we'll be also highlighting on Action News Jacks. Dr. Courtney Hackney recently retired from the University of North Florida, but that has not stopped him from staying involved in the coastal environment. During his career, he's published over 60 scientific papers and books on many subjects, including tidal marsh ecosystems and wetlands. Tim Telfer is the Public Lands and Natural Resources Manager for Flagler County, where he currently oversees 10,000 acres of natural areas. He does wear a second hat during emergencies and serves in Flagler County's Emergency Operations Center, drafting situational reports and post-storm assessment and response. Jessica Beach is a professional engineer at the City of St. Augustine's Public Works Department. She oversees the city's stormwater program and also has a regulatory background with the St. Johns River Water Management District. Spoke with Jessica a little earlier this morning. She has no downtime these days, of course. Doug Davis is the president and CEO of Fletcher Davis, which is one of the oldest and most well-respected development companies in the Southeast. They focus on environmental and conservation-based planning and development techniques. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Nikki Dix is the research coordinator at the GTM Research Reserve. Nikki establishes research priorities and oversees monitoring programs in the context of regional, state, and national objectives. So that's our panel. Let's give them a round of applause. We're going to get started. I've just got several questions that I'll start out with, and then it'll be up to you guys to continue the discussion, to facilitate, and feel free to write down questions as we go here, so that you can remember what you might want to ask a little bit later on. And panelists, please feel free to answer whenever and wherever you are able. Just make sure we're pushing the microphone down and back and forth so we can hear everybody. All right, are we good to go?
Yes.
All right, audience, are we good to go?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So those of us with scientific educations and backgrounds tend to take it for granted that everyone thinks scientifically and rationally, and therefore we I thought that was an interesting way to put it, right? And therefore, remember, I used to assume. And therefore, we assume that the decisions we make as a community should and will be based on the best available science. However, A large segment of society is not necessarily scientifically literate and is liable to fall prey to claims that science is not objective, but rather a tool for advancing perhaps a political agenda, for example. How do we educate people who are not at state of the reserve and who may not know or may not care anything at all, because all of us, as voting members of society, are ultimately decision makers? I know, it's a mouthful there. Who would like to tackle this first? Okay, please.
All right, hi. So me and Dr. Mike Shirley have recently been involved with an artist, Olivia Block, who I think you'll maybe see some stuff about later, and have just kind of been thinking more and more about the art of science, which is the theme. And we all went to this panel at Telfer College a couple nights ago, and we were sitting there with the undergrads who helped Olivia. And they all really impressed me. So what happened was these undergrads were research assistants for Olivia. She came to our reserve and recorded the sounds of the estuary. So we took her to an oyster reef, she went to a marsh, and these students went out there and helped her, and you have to just sit there and be quiet. And the students were commenting on how they really appreciated having, I can't remember if it was like 10 minutes or an hour, without their cell phones, you know? And they started really thinking about, this is how the natural world is all the time, all around us and everything. And so anyway, I think part of it might be reaching out of our comfort zone, getting involved with people that we don't normally work with, and art is a good example, I think. So I personally have been thinking about that and hope that we can start exploring art and other disciplines in relation to science.
Well, I'll build off of what Nikki said. Something that's been effective for us over time is at a local government level, what we've learned is that your voice is the best vehicle to deliver your message. And so rather than sitting back and relying on people to actively pursue and disseminate the information that you're putting out, we do make an effort to try to get out into a more intimate setting, out into the community, out into the area that's effective, and try to communicate directly with people. You get a much better response. Even if they don't absorb your message, they at least appreciate you being there and are more open to compromise on issues.
I think part of the issue is pure accessibility. Today there's accessibility of information that is, I would just say, scientifically correct, and there's equal accessibility sometimes, unfortunately, to information that is not scientifically correct. I was amazed when I was at the lighthouse in St. Augustine, and the gentleman there informed me that the sea level had never changed there. And this was a guy, well, we have to be careful about that, and accessibility of information needs to convince people that sea level is not a myth. Historically, it has been here for many, many years. How fast it is rising in the future is what we're debating, not whether or not it will rise.
Hi. My reaction to the question is, it begins with me. And I look at my path and I think about what it means to be objective. Begins with being curious. And I think as leaders, as students, as scientists, as lay people, as folks listen to the news, listening objectively, but then ultimately circling back around and studying it for yourself as best you can. Plenty of access to good information, but I think curiosity is where it begins, and I think it's all of our responsibilities, because it's easy to fall into one camp or the other and to just go along with dogma, but it ultimately is a responsibility of each of us to really understand.
Well, having spent almost 40 years teaching student ecology, one of the observations I've had is that as time has gone by, fewer and fewer of my students had any contact with the natural world, less and less. My early years of teaching, probably 90% of my students came from farming country sort of students. And they were so well aware of so many of the principles, even if they didn't realize they were principles. And as time went on, more and more students were from the Northeast and cities. It was as if I was speaking to aliens. They had no concept of some basic things that went on in the natural world. And even here, when I moved to North Florida, we have a class that we taught in the summer, and we spent actually 24 hours out in the marsh in this very site. And the number of my students who were Florida students who came and told me, I never realized the tide went in and out like this. They knew about tides, they were educated, but they didn't have any perspective from sitting at one spot and doing what we just heard some students who were amazed at what happens when you're an hour without your cell phone. They watched the tide go in, they watched the plants and animals react. And if I were to say one thing we could do, it would be to get students out into the natural world more and more. It's very difficult for teachers to do that now. It's costly, there are all sorts of issues, but that would be my perspective. Get students into the natural world so they actually can observe and be curious.
What else?
So having recently joined the city, we're dealing with that very issue because we have a lot of challenges as a city, looking at sea level rise and what we've seen impacts in different communities and flooding and things of that nature. And one of the projects that I've been overseeing, we did a big push on outreach and education. We put together a video with some of our video crew and just getting that message out to the public, trying to go out through our social media, on our website, putting maps together and trying to push that message out because it is a big deal on the public education on that. And to build on what Tim and Nikki have said too, the voice of the community is very important. We want to be hearing what that is and taking that, being sensitive to that as well. And one of the other projects that the city's currently working on is, as an engineer, we don't always communicate very well. It's very technical. And then we tend to lose people that are looking at us like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So sometimes we need help and maybe getting people that are specialized in that area, whether it's through artwork or some type of other platform, just reaching out and getting some of that help to get that message out and correctly disseminating the correct information, but also trying to educate and build that community consensus on the issues that we're facing as a city.
Sure.
Building on that in the engineering lack of communication, I think it's really important to begin to tear down some of the silos in communication. If you hear people talk today, you'll hear people talk about ecology, you'll hear people talk about engineering. You rarely hear people talk, and you may hear people talk about city planning and things like that, but you rarely hear from a student perspective an integrated discussion of how all of this has to be blended together to make a future in a coastal area. And I think that is something that I would like to see is one more integrated work in these areas and also more integrated communication.
Panelists, anyone else want to add anything? Jessica, I immediately thought of media could help maybe in that regard, right? Yeah. This is very difficult for me, by the way, as a moderator, because there's so many things I want to ask and chime in, but I will not. I will refrain. But that's the kind of things you can be scribbling down notes on and that you can follow up with here in just a few minutes. All right, so let's move on to another question here. Regarding recent storm events such as Hurricane Matthew and Irma, what have we, city, county, academia, agency, as a community, what have we done well? What was not done well could use more information perhaps, or needs to be addressed for future risks? Now that is a loaded question, I know, because there's a lot there to consider. Go ahead.
I have the good fortune of being a member of a research group that's looking into this problem of updating FEMA's flood maps. Everybody starts throwing things now. But I think everybody realizes after Harvey and Irma that you cannot run surge models on the coast without considering the river flows and the rainfall and the hydrographic model inland. And Irma, of course, here, if it had been a coastal model, if it had been flooded from the ocean, it would have taken about a Cat 3 or something, using terms I shouldn't use, but that's part of communication. And and of course it wasn't here, and it was nowhere close to that. And what we find out is this is something that FEMA is now trying to move into. It's not just Jacksonville, obviously, it's Tampa. Tampa is a disaster waiting to happen. Norfolk and Virginia Beach and Hampton, same thing. Savannah, Charleston, you can just go up the coast, and there's really little that people can do to hide from it. I mean, that's just one issue. There's actually a lot of issues, and we take it for granted when we go into a cycle of not many storms in an area. We forget that these storm patterns shift, sometimes of a decadal, sometimes multi-decadal fashion. And we're now in a period of fairly active East Coast storms. It happened back in the 1920s, and it happened we had of course, the hurricane that devastated Okeechobee and the levees there, and the largest single death toll in the United States, 5,000 people in a natural disaster, was an inland area. And Okeechobee is still waiting for us. And it is probably still just about as scary if you had the right situation occur.
Well, if we're addressing what we do badly, it's that we don't learn any lessons at all. I think it was in the mid-1970s, I was taking a class, and the professor, who was an old Louisiana professor, showed us basically what was going to happen to New Orleans with a particular orientation of a hurricane. I think it was only a Category 2. That was Katrina. We knew it was coming, and you could make that same point for so many other places along the East Coast. Don just mentioned a couple of them that are just ripe for disaster. And we know it's coming, but what we have done really poorly is to put that information, that knowledge into policy making, into rule making, because essentially, if you just think about it, our timeline is 2 or 4 years, depending on the election of politicians. That is the way in which we think. We don't really think long-term at all. The science is there. We pretty much know when or what's going to happen. We just don't know exactly when. And that has been our biggest failure.
Keep the microphone moving. I'm gonna answer the question and take the we and kind of step back from a position and just talk about some observations that I've seen being involved in both of these storms. And so we, I mean more as citizens here, not necessarily at the local government level, but at the national level. Communication has been interesting, and I'm actually going to put that in a little bit of a positive light, maybe not intentionally, but what we've seen is there was a fairly good response from citizens at the Flagler County level to both of these storms, not because of necessarily our message alone, but also because of what they had seen going on around them. And Irma was a great example. Irma took place right after Harvey, and there was a sense of heightened concern as that storm moved in, and we did see a response with citizens there. The negative, and I'm stepping back, and as citizens, the unfortunate thing that I've seen post-storm is how poorly people were prepared for them. And this is not just, I went out and bought some cans and water. This was, do I have cash on hand? Do I have the financial resources to weather the post-storm? Do we have proper insurance on our home and structure? Those are all real-life issues that people have come to us with, and it's been unfortunate to observe.
So I joined the city May of last year, and before that I was with the St. Johns River Water Management District, and we were like as far as Hurricane Matthew, we were like a support to local governments to help them with their recovery efforts. I know I had done a number of inspections for Flagler County, looking at their stormwater systems, doing damage assessment and things of that nature. So it was more of a supportive role in my previous job. When I joined the city, we went through Hurricane Irma, and there were lessons learned that the city went through with Hurricane Matthew the year prior, so they were very well prepared under Irma as far as lessons learned, just getting contractors in place ahead of time, so when the storm came through, they could immediately start doing debris cleanup. So they had, I would say they did very well as far as the Irma and getting things staged and getting everything lined up and planned, and to be able to make that recovery as quickly as possible, which is not easy. But then it's also, it impacts the city when you've got back-to-back storms in the same fiscal year, like budgeting. That's a challenge, I would say, when you're talking about things that's not doing things well. It's hard to predict those, but having that preparation in place and the financial resources to be able to go through. And we've applied for a number of projects and grant funding through FEMA to be able to do some mitigation measures. We have a seawall project that was completed in 2013. It functioned very well during both hurricanes, Irma and Matthew. It was designed for Category 1 storm surge. We had a lot less damage as a result of that system being constructed. So we're actually looking at doing more projects similar to that to help with the providing those defenses and mitigating damage on that too.
I apologize ahead of time if I'm not answering your question directly, but the things that pop into my mind, just so I kind of take this discussion in a slightly different direction. Two thoughts. Number one, having been born and raised here in North Florida, the response of my neighbors and the just citizens in general seem to be at all-time highs. I don't know if it's just because of social media, good job by the news, or what it is, but in general, folks respond a lot better these days in planning and evacuating better than they did, even 20 years ago. So I think that's a positive thing. When I think about design, I'm both an engineer and a developer, and I think about where we are today, and this is outside of the Barrier Island discussion, so let's just take that off the table. But in general, when we think about design, I think that local government, state government, federal government has elevated the considerations when we think about flooding, when we think about natural disasters, to the point where we enjoy a fairly stable lifestyle. If you're inland, when we do neighborhoods today, almost all power is underground. The way that we're treating stormwater with us directly as a developer, we try to interrupt the natural landform as little as possible so that the superficial aquifer stores as much water as possible. But even outside of what we do, most regulations provide for attenuating and storing large quantities of water. So if you go to large, newer neighborhoods, you're not going to find flooding problems. Now, that doesn't solve the problems for Charleston and Savannah and downtown St. Augustine, of course. But I think there is a lot of bad that you can dwell on. But when you think about some of the regulations that we've integrated into Florida, and specifically North Florida today, I think we see a lot of really good outcomes as it relates to these natural disasters like hurricanes and so forth.
All right, so I have two answers. One is based on me as a citizen, and one is based on me as the research coordinator here. So our house was flooded with Matthew and Irma, and we've gone through, I feel like we learned a lot. And like Doug said, response, I feel like has been good throughout the communities. With Irma, we learned to take all the stuff out of our house and take it inland, and we didn't lose as much. So we learned a lot there. But it's the rebuilding part and the resilience part that I think as a community we really need to start implementing. And so what we found is that we have insurance money to rebuild our house, but they will only pay for you to rebuild it the way it is. It's a lot harder to start thinking about elevating it and building it back in a way that this won't happen again. And so as a community, I think that's one of our challenges. And other communities have done it. I know after Sandy, they did a lot of bracing houses. But for some reason, it's just not happening here. You know? So as a research coordinator, it's kind of similar. We had a good disaster response plan in place. I feel like we prepared, and we actually left our water quality instruments in the water so that we could catch what happened during the storm. And you'll hear a presentation about that later. So in terms of research and monitoring, we had things in place, and we were able to tell the story of what happened in the estuary. On the flip side, we don't have a good plan for recovery. So if your staff's houses are destroyed, you know, what do they do? How do they come back to work? And those things weren't really part of the discussion. And actually at the NERV's annual meeting, we talked a lot about that because several reserves had been through hurricanes in Puerto Rico and Texas. And we had someone from the Virgin Islands there saying the same thing, like, we all were fine during the storm, we were safe, but now what? You know? And so I feel like as a community, that's somewhere we need to go and start talking about recovery. For a research program, I know we want to talk about a research recovery plan so that if something happens to our data sondes or our monitoring infrastructure, we have a plan for what to do, as well as maybe we should be inviting visiting scientists to come and study what happened after the storm, you know, from a research angle. And so kind of just getting all that in place so that after a storm, you're ready to attack it.
Dr. Resio.
Adding to the list of things we don't do too well, I would like to point out that communicating risk, that's sort of the integrated concept, you know, where you understand it's not just sea level rising, it's what's the risk, and not just to economics, but also to ecologic and also to the social fabric of our area. And we need to consider that in a much broader context than we do in a community approach. Most people in this room probably don't realize that if you have a 100-year, quote, storm, like FEMA, or a 100-year level, the odds are within your mortgage lifetime are probably at least 1/3 or higher that you will lose it. So if people don't understand that, and as sort of a closure on this, things get swept through sometimes because they have big economic impetus. And would you believe after Irma that the study of the impact of dredging and the deepening on the St. John's didn't have river inflow considered in it? So you then have to say, well, how much more impact would it be and where? And I think this is something that, and one reason I'm bringing this up is because obviously there's a good social network here, and you might be able to do something about that.
Yes.
Mike, before you jump to the next question, we took an informal poll in the back, and we decided that with your expertise and knowledge, and we're so honored to have you here, we would like you to chime in and answer things and ask questions also. No, we need to tell him that he needs to talk to you, so please, we encourage you to do that.
Okay, I will on occasion. But as a moderator, you really want to hear the panelists more than anything else, to be honest with you. So there's places where I'll chime in as I see fit. There's so many places, you guys. And you never want a TV guy to start talking because then it just kind of stops you. So you gotta be careful. But I appreciate that. Thank you. You said that the insurance will pay to rebuild it as it was, but they also expect you to rebuild it higher, right? But they won't pay for that? Is that how it's going to go down?
That's what we're trying to figure out. So if you have been flooded twice within 10 years, and if the repairs cost more than 50% of the value of your house, the county will determine that you are significant loss or something like that, and you can get $30,000 through FEMA through your insurance to build it higher. But $30,000 does not help you build a whole new house.
Okay. Yeah, there's so much to consider when you're talking about rebuilding and mitigation. Somebody mentioned mitigation, and it's not talked about enough. It is not talked about enough. It's how are we going to change the weather or the climate? Folks, we're not going to. I think mitigation is so critical. All right, next question. Are we good on that one, sir? That particular one? Yes, go.
We didn't really talk about what we do well.
Okay, good point, because there are some good stories.
There actually are some facets that work fairly well. And Don and I both had the, I guess it's the luxury of serving the president as an advisor to the Corps of Engineers. Don was on the Coastal Advisory Board and I was on the Environmental Advisory Board. These are congressionally mandated boards, and our job was to advise the chief of the Corps of Engineers. And if you haven't paid attention, the Corps of Engineers does a lot of things, not just dredging, but they're responsible for maintaining waters and edges in the whole U.S. And it was fascinating to watch the process as it occurred after Katrina and a number of other things. Because what became very clear was that there were and there are plenty of people who can provide the information, the advice that the Corps of Engineers needed. And that part of what we do can work well. Some states have advisory boards for coastal development that work well. What has happened in the recent past is that a lot of the advisory boards essentially can provide information, but then the political process takes over and ignores it. And that is the unfortunate part. But the advice can be there. It's just a matter of having legislators and whole state systems that can follow it.
Anyone else on the panel want to add anything else? Okay, very good. All right, the next question. Have recent storm events changed the way the communities are being developed? As you drive along A1A, I mentioned that just a few minutes ago, you see many homes are for sale, have been sold, and are being rebuilt. What can and should our community do to be more sustainable and to be stronger? And maybe I should add logical. Who wants to tackle it first?
I'll jump in there. I think you just don't build. I mean, you don't develop and you don't build if you don't want to assume the risk. You don't buy a home in a flood-bound area. It seems, I mean, it just seems pretty simple to me that there are risks associated with it, and most people now, I think, can appreciate what those risks are. To me, the question is twofold. It's if you are going to build in flood-prone areas such as the barrier islands, are there things that you can do? And I don't know if that's your question. You know, I'm an advocate of moving the development inward to the other side of the intercoastal waterway. I've worked with Dr. Mike Shirley and a lot of the folks here. We've studied flowways, and we look at these things when we're doing development, and you can, through relatively available information, understand and predict how floodwaters will influence the upland areas. And so I think much of that's being incorporated into the design these days. Most people don't understand that. I think, again, local governments, state government, they're increasingly requiring that this be considered, not only directly through the wetlands themselves, but through upland buffers and other sorts of things. So I think much of the development techniques are largely integrated into development, but that's if you're talking about being outside of these surge areas. If you're within the surge areas, I think we just have to understand their nature is going to have its way, and we're just going to have to, Nikki used the word resilient. I thought that was a really good word. I mean, you just have to understand you have to be resilient, you have to prepare for it.
I think it's questionable as to whether or not A1A is our coastline now in some places. Who else wants to?
Well, I think that often we get stuck in this paradigm of static positioning, and you heard from the plenary speaker this morning that isn't realistic. And the issue then is, what do you do about it? How do you respond after a hurricane? Everyone wants their house back. And of course, you probably noticed down in South Ponte Vedra, some of those places don't really have a place for a house. And in some states, what the policy has been is to basically have a planned retreat. Not that you make everyone move, but essentially those houses right on the shoreline, you make it harder to rebuild, or the funding for not rebuilding is there. It's not going to be cheap. The biggest issue, frankly, isn't a mindset. It's the fact that many communities rely on that tax base. And the biggest push to rebuild those endangered houses on endangered pieces of property comes from municipalities who are looking at tax base.
Good point.
Wanted to touch on, maybe not so much on the development, but what Public Works with the city is doing. With the 2 hurricanes, the city also just recently participated in 2 studies, a coastal vulnerability assessment for our city, and also a Florida Community Resiliency Initiative pilot project and an adaptation plan. So kind of the timing of all of these different pieces, the vulnerability assessment looked at the city and where we were vulnerable, especially to sea level rise. And one of those is our wastewater treatment plant facility. And so kind of stemming from that, the city's working on a resiliency plan on what can we do to make our city more resilient, and that's been a big push by our mayor. And we're just recently forming a group to start tackling that and come up with that plan. And I mentioned communication is definitely key, and kind of communicating what the risks are to us as a community. But it also ties into, on the public works side, when we're planning out these projects, we need to be looking long-term. What are we dealing with as far as sea level rise? And then building in, does it make sense to rebuild this road in a coastal area that's going to be flooded, and then all that money that's been invested is going to become damaged? So we have to look at it from a different perspective, what they call return on investment when you're looking at long-range planning. So the city is very much aware of this, and I think the 2 studies that we have posted on our website have brought to light a lot of these areas that we're looking to start addressing and building into that. So taking that into effect from the studies, then you had 2 hurricanes, and we're seeing firsthand the effects of that. And so I mentioned, we have a seawall project that's already been constructed. The city has a number of projects coming up from a mitigation and resiliency standpoint that we're going to be taking underway over the next few years, and we're getting federal funding on for some of those. So I think from the city's standpoint, from that aspect, we've learned a lot from the storms, and we're educating ourselves with these assessments, and we're trying to be proactive and do what we can to make our city more resilient.
Yes, sure.
Well, I'll also kind of dovetail off of Jessica's comment in a little bit different perspective. And I think what we see now is that there are a great number of considerations on new construction that come in. One of the biggest problems that we deal with is the older construction close to the ocean there. There's a number of communities that were constructed prior to stormwater rules, and they don't drain properly during storm events. There's still a number of septic tanks that are in quite a bit of danger of being flooded, and you know the results from that. So one of the areas that needs a lot of focus is trying to retrofit and deal with these older communities that didn't have the benefit of the modern rule system that we all function under today.
I think one of the things we have to realize is that we're really not in an equilibrium here at this moment. We are out of equilibrium. Anytime you build structures and you artificially nourish and you again consider how we can maintain an area, we develop a place that when that threshold is exceeded, we see a disaster. In other words, it's a much larger impact. I think that the sea level is going to continue to rise, and the places where we are developing would be well served by the document that had to go out every time somebody sold a house that said, here is the risk that you are taking on building here. Here is what we expect could happen, and here's and it would be done in probabilities, which a lot of people don't like. It's not going to say you have 3 years and then you can. It's going to say you are taking on a 50% likelihood at this particular place of losing it in 10 years. Now, if you want to invest in it, go ahead. But if you don't, but now this, I mean, FEMA to some extent mitigates almost in the past tense. If you have damage, you have a problem, and their flood maps are supposed to do it in the future tense, but those flood maps are not really one that they are done at a scale that you can recognize. They have I mean, almost everybody here, if you live near the beach, you know you're in a flood zone, and you say, well, so what? And you blow it off. I think if you could take that into some meaningful metrics for people who could understand what that is doing to them, and also what that is doing to the natural environment if you try to overcompensate for it. Anyway, that was just an idea.
Anyone else? Okay, great. I'm going to just be slightly more specific. You guys have all touched on it more or less, but I think there's we can even go delve into this slightly more and be more specific, perhaps. More blunt, maybe is the right word. Should people leave coastal areas? Live elsewhere? Or should we rebuild? And many of you touched on it, but maybe a short, if possible, yes or no, and why on that. I mean, and it's a good question, because in past huge floods in the last 20 to 30 years, there is precedent for moving entire communities. And like I said, of driving down A1A, where is our coastline these days? Yeah.
Well, I'm originally from the Florida Keys. And one of the facets of growing up on a chain of islands is the fact that you're very aware of where the water comes during hurricanes. And it was always interesting to me that the lowest islands were the ones that were built upon by people from the mainland. The locals didn't build them. But it is also very clear, if you go to the lower keys right now, there are 4 or 5 keys that were pretty much wiped out. And when those sorts of things happen, it should be pretty straightforward not to rebuild, but of course they are. And there clearly are places where the risk, as Don keeps mentioning, the risk is so high that from a societal standpoint, we shouldn't do it. I know that property rights usually trump just about everything else, but even though folks say, well, it's my money, I don't need insurance, I'll build on there still is infrastructure that has to be provided. There have to be roads, there has to be power. And so it isn't just the individual that has to make that decision. It's really society that needs to decide when the risk becomes so great. And that's probably something that could be politically discussed, but again, it becomes a private property thing. But there are ways in which the decision can be made.
As we went through this coastal vulnerability assessment, there's actually a tool online. It's a sea level rise sketch planning tool that the University of Florida put together, and I sat in on a workshop on it, and I think it ties into the communication that we've been talking about. If people are educating and know what risks are going to be coming, then you can make a personal decision. Do you stay? Do you build? Do you make it more resilient? Do you flood-proof your home? Things of that nature. From the city standpoint, the challenges are looking at infrastructure, and we had talked about where do you put the capital dollars to do these types of projects, and going through a prioritization and looking at long-range planning, because you know there is an expectation of providing services, water, sewer, stormwater, things of that nature, and so you do have to look at it throughout the city and figuring out where does it make sense to make those investments, and then at some point, depending on the range of planning, I think that's the other challenge is we're in agreement that the sea level rise is happening, but it's the rate. So how do you plan for that? As an engineer, we want to look at our end condition and plan for that. But because there's such a range on that, it makes it hard when we're looking at building projects as well. So again, it's from the city standpoint, we have to provide level of service. So we have to start looking at projects and being able to accommodate that for a certain time frame. And then for private property owners, they have to make a personal decision. I think communicating and understanding those risks, like we talked about, those high risk areas, and really understanding what's potentially being implicated with that. So I think a big communication theme we've been talking about today is that educational component and really understanding what we're dealing with.
That's a great question. It's an intimidating question too, because the more I think about it, my mind goes in different directions. But I would say at this moment, just having been posed with it, I'm never a fan of compelling someone to do something. So the idea of just requiring folks to pack up their stuff and leave doesn't appeal to me. However, I think there's a balance. I think that I love the idea about the risk memo that you have to sign when you buy something, but I think that if we as a society do begin to understand the implications, the financial drain it has on government, I think if you begin to lessen the response or the investment that we're willing to make in some of these highly critical areas, and you gradually wean them off of the investment in infrastructure and everything else, I think that the financial burden will begin it will drive people's decisions. And so I think, like any model, as you begin to put pressure on it, I think people will begin to retreat, and those who don't will at that point at least understand and hopefully accept the consequences of what's going on.
Good point. Financial burden needs to be realized by those that are building there, right, and making that investment. Sure.
One of the little-known facts about rebuilding after storms has to do with the federal government's role in it. Essentially, the federal government will kick in whatever it takes to rebuild the infrastructure in areas that are at high risk. And in fact, in the places where the federal government doesn't provide that guarantee, typically after storms, the local communities start abandoning those areas just because it's not economically feasible. But as long as there's a big government to come in and provide all the money you need to put things back in places where they shouldn't be, then the development keeps going back in the very places where it shouldn't be. So it really is an economic issue. It's just a matter of who's paying for it.
And maybe just to summarize this question is not unique to coastal Florida, and it's not unique to hurricanes either. This is a question that's asked throughout the United States, whether it's along the Mississippi with flooding or out west with wildfires. Local governments struggle with how to deal with this situation where people voluntarily put themselves into dangerous situations and don't want to move. There's less resources available now to try to have functional emergency management in these situations. So it's a common problem. There's something with human behavior here that we can't quite figure out, that people voluntarily put themselves in these dangerous spots and refuse to leave.
You raise a good point. There have been a lot of behavioral studies that have become very popular in the last 20 years that I did not realize how people react and behave before, during, and near enough in the early part of my career. I'm getting it now. And so to that point, in my job, when I'm communicating risk or whatever it might be, I have no problem overstating it. No problem overstating it. It always used to be a concern of mine early in my career, but it is clear that it needs to be stated, restated, and perhaps overstated. So, good points. And Dr. Resio.
I will blaspheme here and say that a lot of the ideas in coastal engineering are outdated. They have been around for many, many years, and they have served their purpose. But where's the innovation? Where is the innovation that actually says, well, we ought to be thinking about a way to close, to protect something when it needs protecting, but it doesn't have to live there permanently. We have to be thinking about things that can work for each community. So the original question about moving back or abandon, I think move back, but do it in a smarter way. Something that actually says we need better ideas than we now have. And the future generation should not be bound to learning to answer the questions, to learning how we answer the older questions, but ought to be posing and answering and developing a future of new ideas and questioning our answers.
What? No, it's kind of what you speak about, right? The new, innovative ways. Anybody else like to chime in here on this one? Okay, very good. And then I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll get to you guys. So the microphone will be yours here in just a few minutes. In our region, we experience nor'easters, high tide flooding more frequently than hurricanes. I think we can all agree over the last 2 years, of course, we're very active for hurricanes locally. Both have just as harmful impacts as hurricanes. What does and can the community do to react to these events that are not recognized as, per se, storm events? I mean, they don't get, everybody knows when a hurricane's coming, or better. And, but a local nor'easter, or a nor'easter can, I think we'd all agree, can be equally damaging, especially from a cumulative standpoint. Okay, there you go.
This is pretty much what I've been doing since I started with the city back in May. I was new to the term king tide, and we talked about a little bit earlier where we go through these cycles where it's like the higher tides, and then I had this firsthand experience. Just backing up a minute, the city, after Hurricane Matthew, looked at implementing what we call these tide check valves, and it was in a specific area, a residential development in the city that had been flooded significantly from Hurricane Matthew. And so this project was prioritized, and when I started with the city, that was the project that was tasked for me to implement. And how these valves work, it's basically, and I think it was talked about earlier in the plenary session, you have these stormwater pipes that sit low, and then the river rises with the tides, it can back up into the pipes, and then it causes a lot of road flooding and what we call nuisance tidal flooding. And so the city was working to implement this project where you put the valves at the end of the pipe, and it actually keeps the tides from backing up into it. However, they work great up to a certain point, but when you get these more extreme storm events, such as a nor'easter with the high tides, it can bypass the tide check valves itself and cause widespread flooding. So I think the city was trying to do some low-hanging fruit and putting these valves in to prevent that flooding, and it's worked great so far, but you do get these more extreme events, and it's harder to manage because you have low roads. If it goes over a bulkhead or if it goes over the road, once that happens, it's going to cause that flooding. So it's definitely a challenge. But one of the lessons learned from that, and I think it's a shift in how we do live our lives. We did a big public outreach on this particular project, and as we were looking carefully on my phone, I have an app on the tide charts because I have to constantly check that. When we had these nor'easters with the tide charts coming up with a high tide, we were trying to push out these public advisory notices through our social media, trying to get that message out, because we had a case back in January where literally the roads were flooded. People were trapped in their homes. They couldn't leave. You're talking about a foot or two of water in the roads, and we were getting phone calls about what do I do? It's like you basically have to wait. Plan your schedule around the tide schedule, and you may have to wait a couple hour window. So if you're planning errands or if you have doctor's appointments. So I think it's a new way of thinking and the reality of what we're dealing with too. So that's lessons that we've learned.
Sure.
I'll take a little bit different angle on this and basically reaffirm what you said. Northeasters are far more abundant all along the Atlantic coast. And in terms of sediment transport and so forth, they are major players. But I'll turn my comments now to the natural world. And one of the things that these extreme events do is they push salt and sand far inland. And you can drive all along the coast, along the intracoastal, and even up into the rivers, and you'll see whole swamps that are dead. This isn't just Florida, this is everywhere. And those northeasters are a real important component of that. But on the plus side, they also push sand up into the marshes and wetlands and essentially help some of the systems keep up with sea level rise. Any marsh that's close to an inlet where there's a sand source, those northeasters are critical in terms of moving sand, moving sediment.
I think that one reason we tend to focus on the hurricanes and the tropical cyclones is that they surpass thresholds that are frightening to us. And the nuisance flooding is not just a nuisance. The nuisance flooding where you're trapped in your house. And this is not, again, this is all up and down the East Coast, particularly more so even in areas that are sinking, like Virginia Beach, Norfolk, that area. And I was recently talking to a group of the people from the state government up there, and they wanted to know what we do about fixing this nuisance flooding. And there were about 10 people in the audience that stood up and said, it's not a nuisance, it's a calamity. And I think that's what the extratropical storms are going to represent here. You're going to have a steady increase in the nuisance flooding, to the point it will no longer just be a nuisance. And you will have a steady increase in the erosion of the beaches and the dunes, and all of that will make you more susceptible to the follow-on processes that are represented by the even more extreme events. But I think nuisance flooding is here to stay and going to get worse.
I just wanted to add that nor'easters were part of the reason we had such a big storm surge from these two storms. So I don't know if it's not taken into account with storm surge modeling, and you guys can tell me, but it was high tide when they hit. And so our tide range is 4 feet or whatever. So with the high water from the nor'easter, the high tide, and then the storm surge, you know, that was kind of like the perfect storm, if you will, in both storms. So I just feel like there's, and it goes back to what Dr. Resio is saying, your expectation of risk. And when I bought my house, I mean, there's a whole Anastasia Island full of houses. I didn't think that I would be the one that would flood, you know? But if somebody had given me that little sheet of paper and it said, even if you get a storm, on top of that, you have the nor'easters and high tide, and I'm like, oh, well, and I could do the math and put my house elevation on there, and, you know, I think that would have maybe changed my mind.
Good point.
I was listening to the news the other day, and I think it was Mayor Curry said that there are enough roads just in Jacksonville alone that Public Works has to contend with to take you to California and halfway back. And when you think about the magnitude of public infrastructure that's already built, Florida is relatively flat. And for the most part, with few exceptions where we pump stormwater, most of the drainage is through gravity flow. When you have a nor'easter, there's nothing you can do about it. The outfall for most areas is the level of water. And so to the extent that level of water rises, then you don't have the relief for the hydrologic, drop in those areas. So I don't think for nor'easters and for things like that, I don't think there's really anything that we can do. I think as we move forward, it begins to address, is it appropriate to build in these areas where you have a relatively small freeboard between higher elevations and whatever the grades may be. So, I mean, that's a whole other discussion. But for today, as it relates to nor'easters, especially in the more barrier island and low areas, I think we're left with communication largely.
And really, the only thing I can do is, at this point, is just try to reinforce the concern over these nor'easters. And Hurricane Irma is a good example for us. I mean, we had it was a relatively minor rain event for us in Flagler County that were flooded for 60 days. And we thought we were rolling into a La Nina warm and dry winter. We have properties we are still trying to drain today. So these are just as serious as the hurricanes. The hurricanes get a lot of the press because it's got a name and it's got a lot of coverage, and there's some serious damage that occurs, and there's no doubt about that. But the nor'easters are just as serious a threat to us.
And you raise a good point. There is a lot of water in the system right now. A lot of water. We put a lot of water in it last summer because it started to rain in May after a very dry spring, and it never quit. And that set the table for the hurricanes that came in August and September. And what people don't realize is that it takes a lot to get the water, that magnitude of water, out of the system. And it's not gone yet. even though we've actually gone fairly dry the last 2 to 3 weeks, it's been a short-term dry spell. There is a lot of water there, and it is going to be interesting to see as we head through spring and toward the next hurricane season what our water system is like. And our hurricane models, our slosh models, they give us to answer your question, Dr. Dix, they don't take into account current water levels or even incoming water. It's just not there right now. The technology isn't there, even though it's as good as it's ever been. I think, Doctor, you agree. So we did warn coming into Hurricane Irma that we were very wet, that freshwater flooding was going to be as much of an issue potentially, if not greater, than the storm surge. But we had record values in several places in Northeast Florida that have never seen water as high as it got right after Irma. And then we had events of winds out of the east and northeast that weren't necessarily spectacular. But a solid 10, 15, 20 mile an hour wind out of the east would not allow that water to go back out. And that has continued to this day since Irma. A lot of people don't even realize that. It's pretty fascinating, actually, but also a concern. Anyone else want to add? Yes?
Well, I hate to give engineers a plug ever. One of the things that I've always admired, the planning side of the road projects has been their ability to look long term. And I remember talking with an engineer when they were getting ready to replace a major bridge about how they were looking at the future, and they were planning for sea level rise on all the bridges over even the little creeks, which seemed really wise. But the engineer basically said what Mayor Curry said. We can do the bridges, but what do we do with the roads? So many of the roads are close to the high water mark. So even if you raise the bridges up, which they can do, I wouldn't say cheaply, but they can do, they're looking at having to raise all the roads. And there aren't many places like Galveston that are going to basically add 4 or 5 feet of land to the whole place. So this is a really serious issue for all of the coastal plain. Infrastructure dealing with the nuisance water, not just the major storms like the hurricanes.
It's fascinating because on a global perspective, if you want to see what it's like, and this happens slowly here, look at Jakarta in Indonesia. I served on the United Nations Committee for the World Meteorological Organization for many years, and in Jakarta, the land in the sea level combination is feet per decade. And they have houses that were built 20 years ago that are now into the water halfway up their first window. And these are things that you want to see how quickly and what happens in such a transgression. That would be a really good case study for a lot of people to look at.
Anyone else? Okay, then I'm going to give it to the floor. You better be ready. Okay, great. Well, it's been intriguing and fascinating. We go on for a long time, but I want to make sure we get to ensure that everyone that wants to have a question or comment and our panelists can discuss it gets that opportunity right now. How are we doing?
We have about a little over 10 minutes for open questions.
Okay, total of 10?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move it. All right. So I'd like you to go to the microphone, identify yourself, where you're from. Please keep your question to less than 2 minutes so that we have plenty of time for others to ask questions and the panelists to keep their answers brief so that everybody else can keep asking questions too. All right, here we go. We have our first victim.
And also, if you have any questions, you can start lining up.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm Richard Bryant, live here in St. Johns County. A micro question. Comments were made earlier about subdivisions being built recently, they're more designed, they got the 100-year, rain event. Is that still accurate? Is that still enough? And I say that because you look at what happened in Texas and Houston, where they got 40 inches of rain. And I live in one of those new subdivisions. Everything works great as long as you're not getting phenomenally big rain events. But even in a 10-year-old subdivision that was designed with water management districts, I assume a 100-year event in place, is that adequate on that subdivision scale. That make sense?
I'll take a shot at just share my opinion. Thanks for the question. It's a really good one, actually. And I think you knew most of the answers. I mean, and I'm coming at this, I'm not a permitting engineer, so I don't really get involved in that anymore. But as I understand it, most stormwater ponds that are really kind of the buffer between taking the water that would have otherwise flowed off of the site and attenuated on the site and then release it, what you're really doing is, from my opinion, you're doing two things. Number one, you're protecting the other subdivisions around you because you don't want to pave over an entire new area and essentially flash flood areas around you. So you want new subdivisions to perform from a drainage perspective much the way that it did in the pre-development condition. So that has been taking place now for far more than 10 years. I mean, that's been, 40 years worth of subdivisions in this area. So that's one point. So they are designed and they do have that characteristic. The other thing, even when they design those ponds to attenuate the water, they do that to a base flood elevation of the 100-year flood. So those models exist out there. Now, that's the science behind it. As a developer, I struggle with this, and here's the reason why. We are highly focused in on keeping the native landform as much as possible. What you do when you raise pond banks and road surfaces to drain to those ponds to base flood elevations equal to a 100-year flood storm, what you're really doing now is elevating our earth 4 and 5 feet above what the natural land is. And you in theory, have protected yourself against a 100-year floodplain, but now you've brought in compacted soils that no longer allow the water to trickle back down into the aquifer. You completely wipe out any of the natural hammocks that you may have in the area. So, like anything in life, you make a good decision here, but it has a negative consequence over here. And so, from my perspective, it's all about balancing, trying to do as least harm as possible when we develop, but also protect from certain conditions. So, I was long, I apologize. I would rather, my stance is I would rather not increase the 100-year flood storm design to a 200-year, a 500-year, or a millennia storm, because all we're really doing is elevating the earth more and more, digging the ponds deeper, filling the air. And we're protecting ourselves from a storm event, but we're also creating a 100% built environment, and we're losing the natural environment.
Tough nut to crack, I think, is summarize that after Resio.
Just a real quick, no, you're not, say, they probably did all of this independent. In other words, they did the precipitation effects and maybe they added tidal, and they probably didn't add surges at the coast at the same time. But obviously, when storms, it rains, and it's one of those things that will catch up with you. So no.
Very good. Next question, please.
Yes, good morning. My name is Greg Wilson, and we live south of here in Ormond Beach. And my question really is to get the panel's ideas on how to better get the public to understand risk that is being incurred, not only by the hurricanes, but by these nor'easters. Many people aren't from here, right? So thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are moving to Florida from all kinds of places. Many of them have never experienced hurricanes or nor'easters or anything else. They see these beautiful pictures. Everybody wants to live by the water, right? You see these pictures of the canal homes, and they're all enamored by this. There's never any pictures of what it looks like after a hurricane or after the floodwaters come up and inundate this whole area. They never see any of that until they've experienced one. Then they go, oh my gosh, what have I done? So my point again is how to better communicate to get the public to understand what kind of risk is being incurred anyway, by living by the water.
Okay. Who wants to tackle this first? And the question then becomes, how do you communicate risk beforehand? I think before somebody's even moved here, is your example, but then also after they've moved here, before, during, and during the storm. And that's something I tackle and have to grapple with on a regular basis. So who wants to Go ahead.
I would just add, the point I would say is just in the preparation phase, not in the post-storm recovery, or anything, but even on the post-storm, I would say an integrated approach. You just don't talk about flooding of a street. You have to integrate everything that could affect the landowners and the ecological aspects of it and the pollution aspects of it. If your stormwater if your power plant goes out and you can't stop the water from flowing into the St. John's, these are all problems, and with an integrated approach, and I'll stop there just for due to time.
Okay. Someone else want to chime in? Okay, I think communicating risk is a very difficult thing to do accurately and properly, and so that people understand it.
Well, I will say that just to try to communicate the difficulty, having been in the Emergency Operations Center and try to kind of deal with these issues as they're coming along, it's a multi-media approach. It's Twitter, Facebook, it's through a radio station, it's through every medium that we can facilitate. There's also a call center that people can call in at and get up-to-date information. So that's kind of during the storm and after. Now, how you change behavior is something that I've mentioned that I don't understand myself. And if anybody has any ideas, we'd be receptive.
I mean, his question is how do we communicate the risk before anybody's ever moved here, right? Really?
That's right. It's really,
So can
total
we do
understanding of what you're incurring by being, first of all, in Florida, but particularly by the water.
So are
for
these beautiful
events.
brochures ever going to have a front page photo of a hurricane hit? Because that's reality, yes.
Well, I think Don hit on it earlier, and this has been attempted multiple times along coastal states, that when you buy a house, you have to sign a statement saying, I understand that the risk is such and such, and that restricts my rebuilding or whatever. That is a really tough sell because of the lobbyists from the selling industry.
To relate to that point too, a little different point, but on the beaches, there's some beaches that don't want to put up signs about rip current risk because it encourages people not to go to the beach. Well, I understand that, but folks, we're losing people every year to the rip currents. So, yeah.
Just to kind of try to finish up that subject, we have a similar situation in that in Western Flagler County there are private roads that are not maintained by the county, and there is a covenant on your deed that says these roads are not maintained by the county. You may be flooded or trapped into the community, and emergency response is going to be significantly delayed. And there's no shortage of people still buying those. So.
All right, yeah, you raised a good point there too. Okay, next question, please.
Hi, my name is Patty Smith, and I've been living in Florida for about 4 or 5 years, but I'm originally from Belgium. And one of my very best friends in Belgium is an architect. And every time I go there, he keeps asking me that same question, and I don't know how to answer him, so maybe you can. And his question is, why in a country where you have wildfires, flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, do you keep building these paper-thin wooden houses? I mean, we built houses, my house in Belgium has walls that are about 3 feet thick. They are made out of stone. We had a tornado like in 2014, which was totally exceptional, where you had a lot of damage from trees that were down, but all the houses are standing. You may have a little damage on the roofs, but the houses are still standing. So I don't know, why do you keep sticking to these paper-thin wooden houses?
Okay.
That's the question.
Good question. Woo! Doug, we're going to tackle this one.
I'll take a shot at it. So philosophically, I think it is at least part of it. I mean, if you think about, as a society, we are such consumers. Everything that we build is meant to have a relatively short lifespan, whether it's, if you were to go back to the 70s and you look at the automobile, the amount of steel that was used in an automobile versus today, I mean, in general, everything that we build is lighter, less, and in many cases doesn't have the shelf life or the lastingness that it would otherwise. So that's just a reaction philosophically to the way I look at things. Specifically related to the integrity of a home, however, I'm not sure if I was to have a conversation with the architect, I would say that largely we're building in response to the elements that we're dealing with. So the building codes do require that the homes that we build withstand tremendous hurricane force winds, and they do. They don't blow away. You may lose shingles and so forth and so on, but the homes are responding to what we have to deal with. There is a point when you're designing something called an efficiency curve. And for every input, whether it's a financial input or a material input or whatever else, you can invest and you get a higher yield, but you reach a point of diminishing return. I'm not suggesting that we've reached the efficient point on a curve for the way that we construct things here, which is mostly stick frame for homes, and and some people do blocks, but I don't think we're seeing a negative outcome from the construction. I think if you were to build a block home 3 foot wide in Florida and it's flooded, I don't know that the cost to rebuild that is going to be any less than it would be to rip out the sheetrock and to redo it otherwise. So I'm not sure that there's a different outcome by building homes. I don't know where the lady went. I'm trying to find her with my eyes to look at her while I'm talking. But I don't know that there's a better outcome from building our homes more stout. But I would be open to a discussion on it. That's just my initial reaction.
Although in the last 20 years, 30 years, going back to Hurricane Andrew, we've certainly come a long way since then, I think would be obvious. Okay. Anyone else want to jump in here?
I'll just add that in my community, in my neighborhood, there were plenty of block homes that flooded. And I think a lot of people think, actually too, during Irma, people tried to build these berms along their houses. They put up dirt with like plastic sheeting, and then another thing of dirt, some more plastic sheeting, and people duct tape their doors and things. But people don't realize the water comes up from below, too. It doesn't just come straight at you. So that's something that the community had to learn the hard way, and nobody said that, so.
Water is difficult. If it can get in, it will get in, and we've seen that in the last couple of years. Anyone else? Ma'am, are you okay with it? Yeah. All right, young man.
I think we've got one last.
Okay.
We have time for one.
You guys need shorter cables. My name's Alexander Pass. I was born and raised in St. Augustine. I'm currently a sophomore at University of Florida. And my question is, are there any future plans to investigate or implement more flood-resistant infrastructure in St. Augustine? I mean, we have permeable pavement now. I did a report on St. Augustine's drainage system and sewer, and they were built in the 1870s and really haven't been updated since. And there's been a lot of overflows in that system. And I was wondering if there's any plans to investigate or implement any better infrastructure to outlast flooding.
Just for you.
Just for me, and you're correct, we have old infrastructure, and the city does have a capital improvement plan that starts looking at these different, like whether it's water, sewer, or even storm, how do you upgrade that? It's very expensive, so we do have to prioritize. So what you may not see is the newer infrastructure integrated with the old, but the city is looking at like resiliency, future long-range planning, if we are gonna make this investment, where do we do that? And so specifically, lessons learned in the storm, you mentioned like sanitary sewer overflows. We just received funding from FEMA to elevate like our panels on our pump stations to get those out of the floodplain. So we're doing a lot of projects now to try to plan for the future, if you will, but they are very expensive. So as much federal dollars that we can do on that, we're looking into it. So, and we're always open to other cost-effective, innovative solutions. So.
Okay. Yes.
I think most people are aware that the city of New Orleans is below sea level, at least a good part of it. And that is one of the aspects of study that has been developed for a number of communities. Typically, it's very much as you described, it's around significant infrastructure, power plants and sewer treatment plants. But that has been discussed for several major cities along the East Coast.
It is a growing problem. I mean, the infrastructure in many cities is just simply old. I mean, that's what happens. So it's a financial conundrum, I think it's safe to say. Anyone else? Okay. I'm sorry you ran out of time for other people that wanted to ask questions, but that just goes to show you how important and how interesting this topic is. A couple things I would highlight. I think I heard one of the screaming message, Mother Nature cannot, somebody said a long time ago, Mother Nature cannot be commanded, should be obeyed. I think that's something we can learn from the last couple of years, if nothing else. Resiliency, I heard a lot. I think that's critical. Fugate used to be our Florida FEMA guy that went to the feds and now is working privately, I believe. But he always preached resiliency going back before 04. And then 04 taught us the hurricane season that, hey, resiliency is important. We need to be prepared. We don't want to be waiting on somebody else to help us. We want to be prepared so that we can come back better, bigger, stronger, and faster than ever before. And mitigation, I think, is the other thing, the screaming message that I take away from this. So let's give a hand to our panelists today, please.